a rusted padlock, a mountain of debt, and a loyal golden retriever sniffing furiously at a false wall. When 28-year-old Abigail inherited nothing but a crumbling Detroit garage, she thought she had hit rock bottom. She was wrong. Hidden beneath the oil-stained concrete lay a $200 million secret that powerful men would kill for. The eviction notice on Abigail's apartment door in Southfield was a bright, unforgiving neon pink. It felt like a cruel joke, a glaring exclamation point at the end of the worst year of her life. She had lost her graphic design job, her savings had been drained by her mother's final medical bills, and now she was officially homeless. Her only remaining possession of any true value was Barnaby, a scruffy, overly affectionate golden retriever mix who currently sat at her feet, oblivious to the fact that their lives were unraveling. When the call came from a probate attorney regarding her late uncle Augustus, Abigail allowed herself a brief, foolish flicker of hope. Augustus had always been the black sheep of the family, a lifelong bachelor, a notoriously reclusive mechanic who lived in grease-stained overalls and smelled perpetually of gasoline, stale coffee, and cheap cigars. He had passed away suddenly from a heart attack, leaving no wife and no children. But sitting in the stale, wood-paneled office of attorney Gregory Finch, that flicker of hope was quickly extinguished. Augustus didn't have liquid assets, Abigail, Finch said, peering at her over the rim of his reading glasses. He pushed a thin manila folder across the desk. In fact, his bank accounts were overdrawn. What he did leave you is the deed to his commercial property, a defunct auto repair shop on a forgotten industrial strip near 8 Mile Road. It's yours now. Abigail opened the folder. The black and white printout showed a sagging cinder-block building with a corrugated metal roof, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with rusted barbed wire. "There's a catch, I assume?" Abigail asked, her voice flat. "There is always a catch," Finch sighed, tapping the paperwork. "The property has $43,000 in outstanding county tax liens attached to it. If those aren't paid within 30 days, the city will foreclose, seize the land, and bulldoze it. My advice? Sell it immediately. The land value might just barely cover the taxes." With no apartment to return to, Abigail loaded her duffel bag and Barnaby into her sputtering 2008 Honda Civic and drove out to the property. The reality of her inheritance was even bleaker than the photograph. Artie's Auto Works was a monument to urban decay. The faded painted sign was peeling, the windows were opaque with decades of grime, and weeds had violently overtaken the cracked asphalt driveway. As she pulled up to the rusted front gate, a sleek, jet-black Mercedes S-Class was already idling by the curb. A man in a sharp-tailored charcoal suit stepped out. He looked entirely out of place amidst the crumbling infrastructure of the forgotten neighborhood. "Abigail, I'm Richard Sterling," the man said, offering a practiced, blindingly white smile. "I represent Sterling Urban Development. We buy up distressed properties in this sector. I heard about Augustus's passing. My condolences. I'll cut right to the chase. I know about the tax liens. I'm prepared to offer you $50,000 for the deed right now. That pays off your debt to the city and leaves you with $7,000 in your pocket to start fresh." It was a lifeline. $7,000 meant a security deposit on a new apartment. It meant dog food for Barnaby. It meant survival. Abigail reached out to take the business card he offered, her mind racing. Suddenly, Barnaby lunged forward. He didn't growl at Richard Sterling. Instead, the dog pressed his nose against the gap beneath the heavy, corrugated rolling door of the garage, whining insistently and pawing at the concrete. "Quiet, Barnaby," Abigail commanded, pulling his leash. But the dog refused to budge. He barked sharply, an urgent, hollow sound that echoed off the metal door. Something about the developer's demeanor shifted. Sterling's smile didn't reach his eyes. His gaze darted nervously toward the garage doors before snapping back to Abigail. "It's a generous offer, Abigail, but it expires when I get back in my car. This place is a toxic dump, You don't want the headache." His desperation was subtle, but Abigail caught it. Why was a high-end commercial developer personally waiting at a run-down garage for a grieving niece just hours after the probate meeting? "I'm going to need some time to think about it, Mr. Sterling," Abigail said, stepping back and unlocking the heavy padlock on the front gate. "Don't be foolish." Sterling's tone dropped its friendly veneer, taking on a cold, sharp edge. 30 days goes by fast. You don't know what you're dealing with here." He slid back into his luxury sedan and sped off, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Abigail rolled up the heavy garage door, coughing as decades of stagnant oil-scented air hit her face. The interior was a chaotic maze of junk. Mountains of old tires, rusted engine blocks, and dilapidated workbenches filled the cavernous space. It was a hoarder's paradise. "Well, Barnaby," she whispered, setting her duffel bag on a relatively clean workbench, "looks like we're sleeping here tonight." For 3 days, Abigail lived inside the gloomy garage, using a camping stove to cook and a hose out back to wash. During the day, she tried to sort through the insurmountable mountains of scrap, looking for anything valuable to sell to a pawnbroker. But by the 3rd evening, her frustration boiled over. She had found nothing but worthless rusted tools and uncashed lottery tickets. It was Barnaby who finally changed their fate. Around midnight, a violent thunderstorm rolled over Detroit, rattling the metal roof of the garage. Abigail was trying to sleep in the small, musty front office when she heard the distinct, frantic sound of metal scraping against metal. She grabbed a heavy steel wrench and her flashlight, creeping out into the main bay. Barnaby was in the far back corner of the garage, a section heavily obscured by a massive broken air compressor and stacked wooden pallets. He was digging frantically at a thick canvas top on the floor, his claws scraping against something hard underneath. "What did you find, buddy?" Abigail muttered, moving the pallets aside one by one. Her muscles burned, but the adrenaline masked the fatigue. She pulled back the heavy, grease-soaked tarp. Beneath it was a thick, steel-plated floor. At first glance, it looked like a standard mechanic's inspection pit that had been bolted shut. But as she shone her flashlight over the seams, she realized there were no bolts. The heavy steel plates were connected to thick hydraulic rams. It wasn't an inspection pit. It was a massive industrial-grade freight elevator. Next to the platform, hidden behind a rusted tool chest, was a heavy electrical box with a heavy-duty padlock. Driven by a sudden, intense curiosity, Abigail found an angle grinder on one of Augustus' benches. The shrieking shower of sparks illuminated the dark garage as she cut through the lock. Inside the box was a single heavy red lever. She took a deep breath, grabbed Barnaby by the collar, and pulled the lever. Deep within the bowels of the building, a massive diesel generator roared to life. The floor vibrated, sending dust cascading from the ceiling. With a deafening metallic groan, the heavy steel floor began to lower. Abigail and Barnaby stepped onto the platform as it descended slowly into the earth, leaving the junk-filled garage above them. The elevator dropped 15 feet before clanking to a halt. Automatic fluorescent lights flickered on, buzzing loudly. Abigail stepped off the platform and gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The subterranean level was completely different from the chaos above. It was a pristine, climate-controlled bunker with a polished epoxy floor, and sitting in the center of the vast space, resting on custom hydraulic display lifts, were 3 silhouettes covered in fitted, dust-free silk covers. Trembling, she walked up to the first vehicle and grabbed the edge of the fabric, pulling it back. The sleek silver curves of a 1955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SLR Uhlenhaut Coupe gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Even with her limited knowledge of cars, Abigail recognized the iconic gull-wing doors and the side exit exhausts. It was a ghost, a myth. She vaguely remembered reading an article about one selling at a private R.M. Sotheby's auction for over $140 million. Her heart hammering against her ribs, she rushed to the second car. A blood-red 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO, a holy grail of classic automobiles, easily worth another 50 to 70 million. The third cover revealed a pristine racing green Aston Martin DBR1. Abigail stumbled backward, her legs giving out, and sank onto the cold epoxy floor. She was sitting in a room with over $200 million worth of automotive history. How did a broke Detroit mechanic get his hands on the most exclusive cars on the planet? She approached the Ferrari, noticing a thick, leather-bound journal resting on the passenger seat. She opened the heavy door. It clicked open with perfectly engineered precision and retrieved the book. It was Uncle Augustus' handwriting. If you are reading this, Abigail, I am gone, and the statute of limitations has finally expired. These machines do not belong to me. They belong to history, and they were stolen from it. Abigail frantically skimmed the pages. The ledger detailed a decades-old conspiracy. In the late 1980s, a ruthless international shipping magnate named Conrad Hughes had used his wealth and black market connections to steal these specific cars from private, undocumented European collections to build an illicit, untraceable portfolio. Augustus, known in underground circles as a mechanical savant, was hired at an exorbitant rate to maintain the stolen fleet in absolute secrecy. But Augustus had a conscience. When Conrad Hughes was indicted on federal racketeering charges and temporarily jailed, Augustus executed a flawless heist against his own employer. He moved the 3 most valuable cars across the Canadian border in disguised shipping containers, bought the derelict garage in Detroit through a shell corporation, and buried them. He spent his life guarding the vault, waiting for Hughes to die so he could find a way to return the cars to their rightful heirs, or auction them off to settle his own score. Conrad is dead, the journal read. But his son Preston Hughes took over the syndicate. Preston knows the cars are in North America. He knows I took them. Trust no one, Abigail. The mud cars see the light of day. Preston will come for them, and he will not leave witnesses. A chill ran down Abigail's spine. Suddenly, Richard Sterling's desperate, aggressive attempt to buy the property for $50,000 made terrifying sense. Sterling wasn't a real estate developer. He was a scout for Preston Hughes. She needed proof. She needed a professional to verify that these weren't elaborate replicas. Using her dying cell phone, she searched for high-end automotive appraisers and found a name, Thomas Harrington, a retired chief authenticator formerly associated with Sotheby's, who lived in nearby Ann Arbor. The next morning, Abigail managed to convince a highly skeptical Harrington to drive to the garage by sending him a macro photograph of the Mercedes' unique engine block serial number. When the elderly, impeccably dressed appraiser stepped off the subterranean elevator 2 hours later, he physically dropped his leather briefcase. The color completely drained from his face. "Dear God in heaven," Harrington whispered, walking toward the Mercedes as if approaching a religious altar. He pulled a jeweler's loupe from his pocket, inspecting the rivets, the chassis stamp, the dashboard dials. "It's real. The chassis numbers match the missing Hughes dossier. Abigail, you have no idea what you're standing in the middle of." Before Abigail could respond, the heavy steel elevator platform above them began to hum. Abigail froze. She hadn't pulled the lever. The only way the elevator could be activated from the surface was if someone had broken into the garage and found the control box. Barnaby's hackles raised, and a low, vicious growl rumbled in his throat. Above them, the distinct heavy thud of combat boots echoed against the metal platform as it slowly began its descent. "Mr. Harrington," Abigail whispered, grabbing the heavy steel wrench she had brought down with her. "Get behind the Ferrari." The mechanical whine of the descending elevator seemed to suck the oxygen straight out of the subterranean vault. Abigail's grip on the heavy steel wrench tightened until her knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white. Beside her, Thomas Harrington, a man who had spent his life in the quiet, refined halls of auction houses, looked remarkably composed, though a bead of sweat tracing the line of his jaw betrayed his terror. Barnaby's low, vibrating growl was the only sound cutting through the hum of the hydraulic motors. "Keep him quiet," Harrington mouthed, gesturing frantically at the dog. Abigail dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around the golden retriever's thick neck and burying her face in his fur, whispering desperate, silent pleas for him to hold still. The heavy steel platform slammed into the floor with a resounding metallic boom. The safety gate rattled open. 3 pairs of heavy combat boots stepped onto the pristine epoxy floor. Abigail peeked around the massive, blood-red rear fender of the Ferrari 250 GTO. Standing in the center of the room, flanked by 2 men built like linebackers and carrying suppressed tactical pistols, was Richard Sterling. The developer's sharp charcoal suit was now covered by a dark trench coat, and the practiced, blindingly white smile was entirely gone. In its place was a look of cold, calculating malice. "Abigail," Sterling's voice echoed off the concrete walls, sickeningly calm. "I know you're down here. We saw the cut padlock on the control box upstairs. You're in way over your head, sweetheart. Make this easy on yourself, and step out." Abigail pressed her back against the cool metal of the Ferrari, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked at Harrington. The elderly appraiser slowly reached into his tailored jacket and withdrew a heavy vintage silver cigarette case. He didn't open it. Instead, he caught Abigail's eye and pointed toward the far wall where the master breaker box for the underground vault's lighting hummed softly. He was telling her to cut the lights. Augustus was a fool, Sterling continued, his footsteps echoing as he began to pace the perimeter of the room. He thought he could hide my employer's property forever. But Preston Hughes has infinite patience. We've been monitoring this derelict garage for 5 years, waiting for the old man to slip up. When he died, we knew the city would foreclose, and we could quietly buy the land and reclaim the vault. You just had to be stubborn. One of the armed thugs stepped toward the Aston Martin, his flashlight sweeping across the silk cover. "Boss, look at these." "Don't touch them," Sterling barked. "Those vehicles are worth more than the GDP of a small island nation. Fan out. Find the girl, but..." She seen too much. Abigail knew she had seconds before they rounded the Ferrari. She looked at the distance to the breaker box, about 20 feet of open space. She looked at the heavy steel wrench in her hand. Then she looked at Barnaby. "Fetch," she whispered, hurling the wrench as hard as she could toward the far corner of the room, directly behind Sterling's men. The heavy tool sailed through the air and crashed into a stack of empty steel oil drums with an explosive, deafening clatter. All 3 men whipped around, their weapons raised toward the noise. "Over there," Sterling shouted. In that split second of distraction, Abigail broke cover. She sprinted silently in her worn sneakers across the epoxy floor, throwing her entire body weight against the heavy gray switch of the breaker box. Instantly, the vault plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. "Get the flashlights on. Spread out," Sterling roared, his voice laced with sudden panic. 2 beams of bright white LED light pierced the blackness, cutting wildly across the room. But Abigail had already dropped to the floor, crawling frantically back toward the Ferrari. "Mr. Harrington," she hissed into the dark. "Here," a refined voice whispered inches from her ear. Augustus was paranoid. If he built a vault like this, he built a failsafe to protect it. "Did you read the rest of the journal?" "No, they showed up before I could." "Think, Abigail," Harrington urged, his voice trembling but firm. "A mechanic of his caliber wouldn't leave an elevator as the only operational mechanism without a physical override. If the power failed, how would he get the cars out?" Abigail's mind raced back to the chaotic garage upstairs. The massive air compressor, the hydraulic rams, the manual release valve. "The hydraulics," she whispered, realization dawning. "When I turned on the generator upstairs, it pressurized the system. There must be a pressure bleed valve down here. If we vent the lines, the elevator platform will be dead. It won't be able to lift. Where is it?" It has to be near the base of the lift shaft. Suddenly, a flashlight beam swept dangerously close to their position, illuminating the silver gleam of the Mercedes hubcap. "I see her," one of the thugs yelled. A suppressed gunshot foot echoed in the enclosed space, the bullets ricocheting wildly off the concrete ceiling, showering them in a fine dust. Barnaby had had enough. With a ferocious, uncharacteristic roar, the golden retriever lunged from the shadows. He didn't attack the man with the gun. He hit him squarely in the back of the knees. The heavy man collapsed with a shout of surprise, dropping his flashlight, which spun wildly across the floor, creating a disorienting strobe effect. "Barnaby, no!" Abigail screamed, terrified the men would shoot her only friend. "Go." "Gook, now." Harrington shoved her toward the elevator shaft. Abigail scrambled on her hands and knees, using the chaotic beams of the dropped flashlight to navigate. She reached the heavy steel beams of the elevator shaft. Her hands scrambled frantically over the greasy, cold metal pipes running along the base. "Come on, Uncle Augustus, where is it?" Her fingers brushed against a thick, circular brass wheel. "A master release valve. Abigail." Sterling's voice was dangerously close now. He had bypassed the dog and was marching straight toward the shaft, his own pistol drawn. She gripped the brass wheel with both hands, planting her feet against the concrete wall, and pulled with every ounce of strength she had left. It didn't budge. Decades of disuse had rusted it tight. "It's over," Sterling said, stepping into the dim ambient light, the barrel of his gun pointed directly at her chest. "Step away from the shaft." Abigail looked up at him, her chest heaving. She looked at the gun, then she looked down at her hands. "You're right," she said, her voice eerily calm. "I don't know what I'm dealing with." She raised her foot and delivered a brutal stomping kick directly to the edge of the brass wheel. The rusted metal shrieked in protest, and the wheel violently spun open. Instantly, a deafening hiss of highly pressurized hydraulic fluid violently vented into the overflow tanks. The entire room shook. The massive steel elevator platform above them groaned, shuddered, and then slammed down an extra 2 inches, effectively locking into its heavy mechanical safety latches. The pressure gauges on the walls rapidly spun to 0. "What did you do?" Sterling screamed, lunging forward. Before he could reach her, Thomas Harrington stepped out from the shadows of the Aston Martin. With surprising strength for an elderly man, he swung his heavy metal-framed Sotheby's briefcase in a wide arc, catching Sterling squarely in the jaw. The developer crumpled to the floor, unconscious before he even hit the epoxy. The other 2 thugs, recovering from Barnaby's assault, rushed forward, but it was too late. "The platform is dead," Harrington shouted. To the emergency stairs, Abigail grabbed Barnaby's collar. She hadn't seen any stairs, but Harrington was pointing to a narrow, flush-mounted steel door hidden behind the Aston Martin's display lift. Uncle Augustus' fire escape. They bolted for the door. Abigail threw her weight against the push bar, and they stumbled into a narrow concrete stairwell. She slammed the heavy steel door shut behind them and threw the deadbolt just as heavy fists began pounding on it from the inside. They ran up 3 flights of pitch-black, suffocatingly tight stairs until they hit another steel door. Abigail pushed it open, and they tumbled out into the dusty, oil-scented air of the main garage. They were back on the surface, and the men who wanted them dead were trapped in a $200 million tomb. Abigail collapsed onto a rusted workbench, gasping for air, her arms wrapped tightly around Barnaby. Harrington leaned heavily against the wall, clutching his chest, his bespoke suit ruined with grease and concrete dust. "We need to call the police," Abigail managed to say between breaths, reaching for her dying cell phone. "No," Harrington commanded sharply, holding up a trembling hand. "Put the phone down, Abigail." She stared at him, bewildered. "They tried to kill us. We have 3 armed men locked in a basement." "And who do you think those men are?" Harrington said, wiping sweat from his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. "Preston Hughes runs a $1 billion international syndicate. He has half the local precinct on his payroll. If you call 911, the officers who respond will likely be the ones who unseal that vault, put a bullet in both of us, and drive those cars straight to a shipping port. Then what do? Harrington reached into his pocket and pulled out his own phone. We don't call the police. We call the people who have been hunting Preston Hughes and those vehicles for 30 years. He dialed a number from memory, waited 3 rings, and spoke with absolute chilling authority. This is Thomas Harrington. I need to speak with Special Agent Jonathan Cade of the FBI's art crime team. Tell him I have found the Hughes dossier. All of it. Yes, I'm holding. Over the next 4 hours, Abigail's run-down garage transformed into the staging ground for a massive federal operation. By dawn, the perimeter was secured by heavily armed FBI tactical teams, blacked-out SUVs, and federal agents. Agent Jonathan Cade, a stern, broad-shouldered man in a windbreaker, coordinated the extraction. Once they brought in industrial generators to repressurize the hydraulic system, the FBI breached the underground vault. Sterling and his enforcers, cold, terrified, and out of options, surrendered without a single shot fired. When Agent Cade finally saw the 3 cars, he took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes in disbelief. "I've chased the ghost of this Mercedes for my entire career," he whispered. "I thought Hughes had crushed it to hide the evidence." Athgler. Abigail sat on the bumper of an FBI SUV, drinking bitter black coffee from a styrofoam cup, watching as forensic teams swarmed her property. "So, what happens now?" she asked Harrington, who was sitting next to her, gently petting Barnaby. "The cars are stolen. I can't sell them. Do I just lose everything?" He explained the reality of the situation. The 1955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SLR didn't belong to a private owner. It belonged to the Mercedes-Benz Classic Center in Stuttgart, Germany. The Ferrari 250 GTO was the legal property of an old Italian aristocratic estate, and the Aston Martin belonged to a British museum. And insurance companies, Harrington said, his eyes twinkling, are pragmatic entities. They don't want the hassle of liquidating these assets. They want to return them to their original owners to recoup their payouts. And under maritime and international recovery laws, the individual who successfully locates, secures, and repatriates stolen cultural assets of this magnitude is entitled to a finder's fee. "A finder's fee?" Abigail echoed. "Usually," Agent Cade said, walking over to join them, "the standard reward from Lloyd's of London for a verified intact recovery is 10% of the appraised value." Abigail's brain stalled. She did the math. 10% of $200 million. $20 million, she whispered, her hand shaking so badly she spilled her coffee. "Tax-free usually if routed through the proper international recovery channels," Harrington added smoothly. "And since you hold the deed to the property where they were found, and you actively protected them from being restolen by the Hughes syndicate, the claim is ironclad. I will personally represent you to ensure the underwriters pay every single cent." The aftermath was a whirlwind of legal paperwork, federal testimonies, and media blackouts. The FBI used the evidence from Uncle Augustus's journal and Richard Sterling's Burnerfords to finally dismantle Preston Hughes's syndicate. A house was arrested at a private airstrip in Geneva 3 days later, effectively ending his family's reign over the black market. True to his word, Thomas Harrington negotiated the recovery bounties. 6 months later, the funds cleared into Abigail's newly established trust account. She didn't buy a mansion. She didn't buy a yacht. Instead, Abigail walked into the Southfield County Tax Office and slapped a certified cashier's check for $43,000 on the counter, clearing Uncle Augustus' debt forever. With her newfound wealth, she completely renovated the derelict property on 8 Mile Road. She replaced the sagging roof, poured new concrete, and restored the faded Artie's Auto Works sign to its original vibrant glory. She didn't turn it into a mechanic's shop, though. She transformed the massive, secure building into the premier classic car storage and restoration facility in the Midwest. a legitimate high-end business that honored her uncle's mechanical genius without the burden of his dark secrets. As for the underground vault, Abigail had it structurally reinforced and converted into a massive climate-controlled animal shelter and rehabilitation center. On a warm Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 year after she had received the pink eviction notice, Abigail stood in the bright, gleaming bay of her new business. She wore a tailored suit, a stark contrast to the grease-stained clothes she had slept in during her darkest days. Beside her, Barnaby, now wearing a custom-made embossed leather collar, barked happily at a passing delivery truck. Abigail knelt down, scratching him behind the ears. "Good boy," she smiled, looking around at the empire they had built together. "Who knew you had such an expensive nose? Did Abigail's incredible $200 million discovery leave you breathless? From a mountain of debt to a multi-million-dollar reward, her story proves that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden right beneath our feet." If you loved this unbelievable true crime mystery, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe for more jaw-dropping stories. What would you do with $20 million? Let us know in the comments below.